The Rise and Fall of the USSR. Zdravstvuyte, comrades. From a political science point of view, the reason the USSR or the Soviet Empire fell was the liberal, or the neoliberal ideologues' Small Russia project. They believed by disassemble the Soviet Empire and giving up satellite states in Eastern Europe and Middle East can bring reconciliation with Western Europe and allow the re-entry to the Western market while maintaining a sizable empire in the Central Asia and Russian-occupied Far East, including Mongolia and Outer Manchuria, and Trans-Manchuria west of Mongolian Plateau. However, the liberals or the neoliberals were such failure of a politician, including Putin and his political godfather, Anatoly Alexandrovich Sobchak. Their St. Petersburg gang failed to tame the Ukrainian gang, resulted into the further dissolution of the Russian Empire post-year 2000. The question today is, how did the communism die in the Soviet Union? And when did the USSR stop being the home of the proletarian revolution? Anatoly was born in Chita, the ancestral homeland of the Qing Chinese royal family, according to Resolving Confusion with the Discourse on Righteousness by the Yongjung Emperor. First, popular theory and conceptions. These factors can be broadly categorized into economic, political, social, and international elements. 1. Economic stagnation. The Soviet economy, heavily reliant on centralized planning and state control, faced a significant stagnation during the latter part of the 20th century. This was characterized by inefficiencies, a lack of innovation, and a failure to keep pace with the technological advancements of the West. The economy was overly dependent on oil and gas revenues, and when prices fell in the 1980s, it severely impacted the Soviet economy. 2. Political factors. The rigid political structure of the USSR, which lacked transparency and responsiveness to the needs of its citizens, contributed to its downfall. The policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, particularly glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed at reforming the Soviet system, but also inadvertently led to increased demands for independence among the various Soviet republics and more vocal opposition to the Communist Party. 3. Ideological crisis and loss of faith. Over time, the ideological underpinnings of the Soviet system began to erode. There was a growing disparity between the communist ideology and the realities of Soviet life, leading to a crisis of faith among citizens and party members. This was exacerbated by increased exposure to the outside world, which revealed the gap between Soviet propaganda and actual living conditions in the West. 4. Nationalism and ethnic conflicts. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic, multinational state, and nationalist movements within various Soviet republics grew stronger in the 1980s. These movements, seeking independence or greater autonomy, were partly fueled by the policies of glasnost, which allowed for more open expression of nationalist sentiments. 5. International pressures. The arms race with the United States, particularly during the Reagan administration, placed an enormous strain on the Soviet economy. The USSR's involvement in the Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, was also a significant drain on resources and was often likened to the American experience in Vietnam, both in terms of financial cost and its impact on domestic morale. 6. Social changes and unrest. Discontent among the Soviet populace was growing due to a variety of social issues, including poor living conditions, lack of consumer goods, and restrictions on personal freedoms. As reforms allowed for more open expression of dissatisfaction, this unrest became more visible and widespread. 7. Leadership issues. The leadership transition from Leonid Brezhnev to Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, followed by Mikhail Gorbachev, saw a shift in policies, but also a period of uncertainty. Gorbachev's attempts at reform were seen as too radical by some within the Communist Party, yet too conservative by many citizens, leading to a lack of coherent leadership at a critical time. Welcome to today's lecture, where we'll embark on a journey through the intricate web of class structures in Russia prior to the 1917 revolution. Our exploration will dive deep into the myriad ways these structures, comprising the production, appropriation, and distribution of surpluses, interacted with and influenced the lives of individuals. This analysis is unique in its focus, as it shifts from traditional lenses like property ownership and political power to a detailed examination of surplus. The Russian Empire's expansion brought with it significant shifts in class dynamics, intensifying contradictions within and between various class structures. After the emancipation of serfs in 1861, a complex transformation occurred, with former serfs navigating between ancient and feudal class structures, and the emergence of capitalist influences adding to the social fabric. Our analysis today will paint a vivid picture of how these class structures and their inherent tensions contributed to the historical landscape that led to the revolutionary moment of 1917. We'll delve into the various class positions occupied by the Russian populace, from serfs to landlords, and the transition from state to private feudalism. This exploration will help us understand the complex interplay between class structures, societal changes, and the revolutionary forces at play. As we proceed, it's important to note that our approach is somewhat impressionistic, shaped by the available evidence and secondary analyses. However, this approach allows us to gain a unique perspective on the multifaceted and dynamic class relations in pre-revolutionary Russia. So, let's begin our exploration of these fascinating and transformative historical dynamics. Part 1. Class Structures and Tensions Before 1917, The Fundamentals. Feudal, ancient, capitalist, and communist, most Russians and others within the former USSR lived in rural areas and engaged in agricultural labor. We begin our analysis with the class structures prevalent in these regions. Notably, feudal class structures were dominant before the 1861 emancipation of the serfs, and as we will demonstrate, they continued to play a significant role thereafter, albeit in altered forms. Russian feudalism before 1861 was characterized by large landholdings, controlled either by private landlords or by the Tsar's state itself. This period witnessed a coexistence of and tension between private and state feudalism, analogous to the relationship between private and state capitalism after 1917. Over 50% of serfs were under state rather than private ownership at the time of emancipation. The nature and interplay of these two feudal forms significantly influenced Russian history before 1917. In the 150 years leading up to 1861, the Tsar's state increasingly pressed its serfs for surpluses, expanded its claims on lower lords, and levied general per capita taxes to boost revenue. These funds were used for various state expenditures, including building an army and expanding the Tsarist empire. Private feudal lords, while benefiting from state activities that secured their existence, often resented the state's demands on their surpluses. The conflict between private and state feudal interests deepened the burden on both private and state serfs, leading to organized resistance. This complex class conflict among serfs, private feudal lords, and the state contributed to the historic decision to emancipate the serfs in 1861. Prior to emancipation, serf households, often organized in villages or communes, maintained relationships of loyalty and fealty to their landlords. These relationships involved specific patterns of necessary and surplus labor performance and the delivery of surplus labor, or its fruits, by serfs to their lords. The manner in which surpluses were delivered varied, with some serfs delivering individually and others collectively through their villages. Feudal landlords existed in a hierarchical structure, culminating in the Tsar. Lower lords distributed part of the surplus they appropriated from their serfs to higher lords, securing their social positions. This distribution included contributions to the church, payments to creditors, and tribute to overlords, among others. Alongside the feudal class processes, various power processes connected lords and serfs. Some landlords directly controlled the economic, political, and cultural aspects of serf villages, while in other cases, villages or individual serfs exercised considerable power. The distribution of these powers was complex and often contested. The feudal class structure within Russian rural households was highly centralized, with many serfs producing surplus for a single lord. This structure persisted even after the emancipation in 1861, leading to the rise of a decentralized form of feudalism. Post-emancipation, the previously centralized feudalism was replaced by a mixture of non-feudal and feudal class structures in individual farming units. After emancipation, the predominant class structure in village farming was not feudal, but rather ancient. The ancient class structure involved individuals who performed both necessary and surplus labor and appropriated their own surplus. This structure faced significant pressures from state taxation, market instabilities, and competition from emerging capitalist elements. Capitalist class structures, which differed markedly from feudal and ancient ones, began to emerge more prominently. In these structures, surplus was appropriated by individuals other than its producers, and labor processes were collective rather than individual. The growth of private capitalist industry, both domestically and due to foreign influence, contributed to the transformation of Russian society. By the turn of the century, Russia was marked by a complex interplay of ancient, feudal, and capitalist class structures, with individuals often occupying multiple class positions. This intricate web of class structures and transitions set the stage for the revolutionary events of 1917 and the subsequent development of Soviet society. The communist class structures, which were not significantly present in pre-1917 Russia, are also noteworthy. While small-scale experiments with communist structures existed within certain religious movements, they were not a dominant force. The Bolsheviks' objective of establishing communist class structures represented a significant departure from the existing class dynamics of the time. The complexities in our survey of pre-1917 Russian class structures, we have primarily examined the fundamental class processes: feudal, ancient, capitalist, and communist. This analysis has focused on the different types of class positions that Russians could occupy as producers and/or appropriators of surplus labor in each of these forms. However, not all Russians needed to participate in one of these fundamental class processes to earn incomes and survive. Besides, or in addition to, these fundamental class positions, Russians could occupy what we term subsumed and non-class positions. Subsumed class positions refer to rules where individuals receive a portion of the surplus from its appropriators as their income. For instance, village moneylenders provided credit to feudal, ancient, and capitalist appropriators, and in return, received a share of the appropriators' surpluses as interest payments. Similarly, governments offered services like police and road maintenance in exchange for taxes and fees, funded by the surplus of these appropriators. Merchants facilitated the conversion of products into money for a fee, also deriving from the appropriators' surpluses. In all class structures, fundamental class positions as producers and/or appropriators coexist with subsumed class positions, receiving distributed shares of surplus. Moreover, societies include individuals who earn incomes through non-class positions. These individuals earn without participating in either fundamental or subsumed class processes. They do not produce or appropriate surplus, nor do they receive a distributed share of it. For example, employees hired by moneylenders, merchants, and governments fall into this category. Their wages are not surplus distributions, but rather separate from the class structure, though they indirectly depend on it. Our analysis has concentrated on these fundamental class structures in Russia from 1861 to 1917. This examination leads us to conclude that most Russians outside their households predominantly occupied ancient fundamental, subsumed class or non-class positions, with their households often centered around feudal class structures. Capitalist class structures, emerging dynamically in urban and rural areas, were the most contentious and socially divisive. Communist class structures, by contrast, were almost entirely absent from pre-1917 Russian experience. These class structures, ancient, feudal, and capitalist, were sites of diverse pressures. Producers and appropriators within these structures grappled over the quantities and qualities of their surpluses. For ancients, such struggles often occurred within the individual. Alongside these fundamental class struggles, subsumed class struggles also emerged over the distribution of appropriated surplus. The competing class structures often threatened each other's existence, intertwining struggles within each structure. We presume that individuals typically occupy multiple class positions within a given class structure. This was certainly true in pre-1917 Russia, where individuals often occupied different positions at various times, even within a single day or week. To understand how class structures influenced Russian history, it's essential to identify how individuals were distributed across these multiple class positions. For example, a peasant wife in pre-1917 Russia might perform feudal surplus labor at home and engage in ancient production with her husband on their land. Her husband might simultaneously engage in ancient production, sell his labor to a capitalist enterprise seasonally, and maintain his feudal rule at home. Their sons and daughters could occupy a mix of ancient, feudal, capitalist, and even non-class positions, depending on their circumstances and choices. These examples illustrate the complexity of the multiple fundamental, subsumed, and non-class positions occupied by Russians. The standards of living and the ideological and political orientations of individuals were deeply influenced by the nature and number of these class positions. The decades leading to the 1917 revolution were marked by significant shifts in these class structures, intensifying struggles over surplus production and distribution. The uncertainty about class positions permeated the thoughts and feelings of Russians, contributing to a sense of societal disintegration. The cultural, political, and economic history of Russia was in part shaped by the specific patterns of class positions occupied by its people. The broad social movements that emerged were influenced both by the existing class positions and the aspirations for future positions within a rapidly changing society. These evolving class dynamics and the interplay of class positions were pivotal in shaping the revolutionary context of 1917. The contradictions and the revolution throughout the 19th century. The contradictions between serfs and feudal landlords intensified. Landlords, facing deteriorating conditions of existence, increasingly demanded larger surpluses from the serfs. In response, the serfs increasingly resisted, sometimes violently, and many deserted feudal agriculture for urban areas or for non-feudal, predominantly ancient class positions in the countryside. Subsumed feudal classes, including merchants, moneylenders, and the church, demanded larger shares of the surplus for continuing to support the feudal class structures. As a result, these subsumed classes gradually shifted their activities toward more promising class structures like the ancient and capitalist, further exacerbating the decline of feudalism. The transition of estates into collections of ancient farmers or large capitalist farms further weakened the remaining feudalism. The increasing pressure on the feudal class structures intensified their internal contradictions, propelling a vicious cycle of decline. Post-1861, the contradictions within the ancient class structures of the peasantry have been extensively analyzed, starting with Lenin's critiques of the Narodniki and continuing with Shannon's recent work. Ancient peasants faced substantial distributions of their surpluses to the state as redemption payments and taxes. Those leasing land from landowners also had to allocate a portion of their surplus as rent. These financial burdens, compounded by market fluctuations and interest obligations from borrowed funds, often led to extreme poverty, land loss, and increasing landlessness. The capitalist class structures, too, experienced sharpening contradictions, albeit amid significant growth. Conflicts over the size of the surplus often led to violent clashes due to poor working conditions and low wages. State interventions were frequently necessary to contain these eruptions. However, the state also played a role in ameliorating contradictions within capitalist structures through supportive policies, particularly under Finance Minister Serge Witt. These policies facilitated the rapid growth of industry and small-scale rural capitalism without imposing significant tax burdens, allowing capitalists to allocate more surplus to accumulation. Contradictions among different class structures took various forms. The ancient and feudal structures in village communes lost laborers to rural capitalists and to urban areas, where they provided surplus labor to capitalists, were found subsumed in non-class positions. Conversely, urban capitalists sometimes lost workers back to the village communes due to unattractive wages and working conditions. The influx of cheaper consumer goods from capitalist manufacturers created competition for the outputs of ancient and remaining feudal structures in rural areas, adding to the financial burdens of all class positions. Inside Russian households, feudal class structures faced pressures as household members engaged increasingly in non-feudal class structures outside the home. These external experiences and the influence of Western European ideas challenged traditional household structures, causing internal feudal class conflicts that reverberated beyond the household. The decline of centralized feudal class structures in Russia led to a mix of decentralized ancient and feudal structures and a growing capitalist class structure, creating deep societal destabilization. Individuals and families had to navigate these diverse and crisis-ridden class structures, contributing to a wide range of emotional responses from optimism to deep resignation. This cauldron of specific class contradictions and conflicts, along with a lack of class consciousness, shaped the events leading up to the 1917 revolution. The revolution itself was seen as a response to and partial resolution of these contradictions, but it was not conceptualized or directed towards reconfiguring the structures of surplus labor production and distribution. Instead, the focus was on altering economic, political, and cultural dimensions of society, which inadvertently transformed the class structures. Post-revolution, a state capitalism with strong welfare and workers' rights commitments emerged, replacing private capitalism. However, this change was often misinterpreted as a transition from capitalism to socialism due to the absence of class consciousness. The Bolsheviks, unable to recognize the persistence of ancient, feudal, and capitalist class structures, proclaimed the establishment of socialism and a move towards communism. This belief persisted for 75 years of Soviet rule, underpinning the notion of socialism, built upon class structures that remained largely invisible. The Bolsheviks' inability to recognize or dismantle these enduring class structures led to a complex legacy, where the goals of the revolution and the realities of its outcomes diverged significantly. Class contradictions and the collapse of the USSR's inception and demise were both deeply rooted in class contradictions. In 1917, the crisis in Russian private capitalism, characterized by a problematic distribution of private property, market dynamics, and the czarist state, had reached a critical point, shaking confidence and support. Socialist critiques, highlighting the unworkability and flaws of private capitalism, gained traction amidst this turmoil, leading to the USSR's establishment as a transition from private to state capitalism. Fast forward to the 1980s, and it was state capitalism, along with its collective property framework, state planning, and the Communist Party, that faced a critical decline. This shift marked a reversal from 1917's trajectory, transitioning back to private capitalism. Contrary to popular belief, the end of the 1980s did not witness a class crash, but rather significant changes in the non-class aspects of Soviet society. These changes only marginally impacted Soviet class structures. The USSR's disintegration wasn't a collapse of communist class structures, yielding to capitalism. Rather, it was more about the nation's dissolution and the decline in the Communist Party's social standing, with only marginal adjustments to the USSR's class structures. Charles Dickens once encapsulated the duality of historical moments as being both the best of times and the worst of times. Similarly, Marx viewed every moment as a play of contradictions. This notion is exemplified in Richard B. Day's depiction of the USSR in the mid-1970s, a period seen as a peak of Soviet achievements and confidence. The USSR was then recognized as an industrial, military, and global power, boasting rapid economic growth that outpaced the US during the same period. This era was marked by a sense of triumph in achieving global superpower status and improving domestic living standards. Soviet leaders saw this as a containment of capitalism and believed in the historical decline of capitalist systems, as evidenced by their international ventures. However, the USSR had its critics, particularly concerning civil rights and political freedoms. Critics of the Soviet system pointed to its economic inefficiencies and lack of political democracy, predicting its eventual downfall. Despite these criticisms, the arguments lost their edge as the USSR continued to improve economically and politically until the mid-1970s. These critiques failed to anticipate the collapse that would occur a decade later. A crucial aspect overlooked by both Soviet leaders and critics was the analysis of the USSR's class contradictions. As these contradictions evolved post-World War II, they gradually eroded the successes and exacerbated the failures of Soviet society. By the mid-1980s, a widespread crisis of confidence in what was perceived as Soviet socialism took hold among both leaders and the populace. This crisis, combined with the leadership's failure to address the underlying issues, reignited the belief in the impracticality of Soviet socialism and the superiority of private market capitalism. Class structures after World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, the USSR, having endured arguably the most severe devastation among combatant nations, did not see a fundamental change in its pre-war class structures. Industry remained predominantly state capitalist, and despite various reforms post-Stalin, this core aspect of what was perceived as Soviet socialism remained unchallenged until the era of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, which marked a significant shift back to private capitalist industry. In agriculture, the main change was in the distribution of farms among different class structures, with state capitalist farms gaining prominence over collective farms and private ancient class structures. The collective farms themselves varied, with some retaining communist class structures and others shifting towards capitalist ones. Additionally, the Soviet Union saw the rise of a so-called second economy, comprising unofficial and sometimes illegal enterprises, which were largely organized as ancient class structures, thereby increasing their relative size within the USSR. To supplement the surpluses from state capitalist industries, the Soviet state continued to derive revenues from various sectors, including private communist and capitalist collective farms. This involved state-imposed pricing mechanisms and taxes, which often adversely affected the agricultural sector, maintaining the precariousness of Soviet agriculture. The post-war Soviet economy was a complex interplay of multiple class structures, each providing yet simultaneously undermining each other's conditions of existence. This precarious balance was upheld by a set of unique circumstances for the first 50 years of Soviet history, driven by internal catastrophes, the threat of foreign attacks, and the fervor of socialist ideology. However, the late 1970s and 1980s saw non-class changes that altered the balance among these contradictory class structures, leading to mutual weakening and societal dissatisfaction. The Soviet leadership's failure to effectively address these issues set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Soviet system in the late 1980s. Despite intense debates and academic scrutiny, Soviet analysts lacked a sustained class analytical apparatus to address the central issues. An officially Marxist society, paradoxically, could not apply Marxist class analysis effectively. This was partly due to the denial of the existence of a complex class structure within the socialist USSR, and partly due to the lack of a sophisticated culture of debate on Marxism itself. Looking at the post-war period, two key questions arose. First, would the USSR strategy of funding its heavy industrial capital accumulation, military and political expenses, state and party expenses, and growing collective consumption be sustainable? Second, could the Soviet state and the party manage the economic, political, and cultural processes necessary to maintain the fragile class structure? The failure to effectively navigate these challenges contributed significantly to the USSR's spiral into crisis. Post-war culture in the aftermath of World War II, the USSR, despite experiencing some of the most severe devastation of any combatant nation, did not undergo fundamental changes in its pre-war class structures. Industry remained state capitalist, and while reforms and liberalizations occurred post-Stalin, they did not significantly challenge the state capitalist industry's central rule in what was perceived as Soviet socialism. It was only under Gorbachev and Yeltsin that a notable shift from state to private capitalist industrial enterprises began to take shape. Agriculturally, there was a shift in the distribution of farms among different class structures, with state capitalist farms gaining prominence. However, some collective farms retained their communist class structures, while others transitioned to capitalist class structures. This complexity necessitated a refined approach to referring to collective farms, distinguishing between their communist and capitalist class structures. The post-war period also saw the growth of what was termed the second economy. This unofficial, often unacknowledged sector, encompassing various enterprises, grew rapidly post-1970s and was largely organized as ancient class structures, thus altering the relative balance of class structures within the Soviet Union. To supplement surpluses from state capitalist industries, the Soviet state continued to extract revenues from various sectors, including collective farms. The means included state-set pricing mechanisms and taxes that often adversely affected the agricultural sector, maintaining its precariousness. In the cultural realm, post-war changes affected class structures in two interrelated ways. Cultural shifts aggravated some class structures' problems by hindering surplus generation while simultaneously strengthening others. This contributed to altering the relative viabilities of different class structures within the Soviet social formation. Notably, post-war Soviet cultural changes did not include any significant challenge to the inherited lack of class consciousness. The class structures comprising Soviet society remained largely beyond conceptualization and debate, with the focus instead on non-class aspects such as distributions of political power and property. The establishment of détente with the West led to significant cultural shifts in Soviet society. The siege mentality gradually dissipated, leading to a relaxation of the crisis environment and a shift in focus from public and social to private and individual concerns. This cultural shift had profound class consequences, weakening the commitment to state capitalist enterprises and collective farms while strengthening private individual ancient class structures. The 1977 Soviet Constitution's recognition of private plots as crucial to Soviet productive life marked a significant shift in official policy. This shift towards privatization and market relations, along with a rising valuation of private over social organizations of production, subtly undermined both capitalist and communist class structures. These cultural changes and their interaction with class structures became particularly evident in the 1980s. As state capitalism faced growing problems, a society-wide sense emerged that advocated for freeing private individual initiative and labor as solutions. However, these discussions did not address whether such private enterprises should be ancient, capitalist, or other class structures. In conclusion, the post-war Soviet culture displayed a deep irony. Despite its communist revolutionary rhetoric and goals, the USSR was anything but revolutionary in its class structures. This class blindness contributed to a resignation towards politics and economics, with progress towards communism becoming increasingly elusive. The focus on non-class aspects of society, such as bureaucracy and inefficiencies, precluded a critical examination of the class structures and their contradictions, ultimately contributing to the USSR's collapse. The connection of high culture to class in the post-war USSR oversimplified the complex reality of its multiple, contradictory class structures. This reductionism, noted by critics, not only suppressed artistic autonomy and creativity, but also marginalized the nuanced class dynamics within Soviet society. Soviet art, heavily influenced by the dichotomy of proletarian versus bourgeois, rarely explored or illuminated the USSR's diverse class realities. Official discourse from state, party, and high culture sources classified state capitalist enterprises, along with private capitalist and communist collective farms, as proletarian or socialist. This classification was based on the Soviet interpretation of class, the means of production being socially owned and distribution managed predominantly through state planning rather than markets. However, this classification did not explicitly connect to the specific organization of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus labor. Art that critically, even subtly depicted these socialist structures or labor experiences within them was often denounced as non- or anti-socialist. Any form of expression that was foreign or challenging to the tastes of workers or Soviet leaders was labeled bourgeois and seen as a cultural enemy. Art addressing the contradictions among different class structures in terms of surplus labor was systematically repressed, both unofficially and officially. For instance, in Vladimir Dudansev's novel, Not by Bread Alone, the depiction of capitalism as a mere residue in the USSR, unlinked to the class in the surplus labor sense, typifies this trend. Post-Stalin, cultural expressions of factory and collective farm issues were disassociated from class in the surplus labor sense, focusing instead on bureaucracy, careerism, or lack of democracy. Post-Khrushchev, critiques of Stalinism, both within and outside the USSR, focused on bureaucracy, careerism, and corruption, without questioning how class structures contributed to Stalinism's rise and persistence. As noted by Louis Althusser, this lack of class analysis in the surplus labor sense was a significant oversight. These critiques primarily targeted the largest bureaucratized institutions, the state and state capitalist enterprises. They attributed injustices and inefficiencies to bureaucracy's inherent nature, which stifled individual initiative and perpetuated a passive population. This led to a growing tendency to favor smaller, less bureaucratized private enterprises, perceived as less corrupt and more efficient. This perspective influenced the approaches of Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin in addressing the USSR's challenges, promoting policies that favored private enterprises at the expense of state capitalist structures. In summary, post-war Soviet high culture, in its celebration and criticism, largely bypassed an in-depth class analysis in terms of surplus labor, focusing instead on bureaucracy and its implications. This omission contributed to a skewed understanding and handling of the USSR's class structures and their role in the nation's eventual crisis and collapse. Post-war Soviet high culture significantly shaped class structures by adopting and reinforcing the dichotomy presented by state and party officials between proletarian positivity and bourgeois negativity. This oversimplification led to a situation where, if the proletarian approach faced a crisis that could not be attributed to bourgeois influences, people might be inclined to reverse their valuation. The crescendo of economic and political problems in the 1970s and 1980s, coupled with détente and the prevalent cultural dichotomy of proletarian versus bourgeois, led many to reevaluate and favor the bourgeois alternatives: private enterprises, individual property, and markets. In the realm of economic theories, there was a significant debate among the top echelons of the state, party, and academia, which directly impacted class structures. For instance, Marxian economic theory has historically debated whether services, like physical objects, should be considered commodities involving surplus value and exploitation. Post-war Soviet practice primarily recognized only physical objects as such commodities, relegating service workers to a different and often lower theoretical and social position. However, developments in Western thought, particularly during the 1960s, led to a shift in the Soviet stance, recognizing service work as equally productive of surplus as object production. This allowed Soviet theorists to refute claims about the diminishing relevance of proletariats in advanced economies. However, this shift also trapped Soviet theorists in a class-blind framework. They equated wage earning with being a proletariat, overlooking Marx's distinction between productive and unproductive labor. Such a generalized view of wage earners as a unified class overlooked the complexities and differences between productive and unproductive workers, leading to oversimplified state policies and enterprise practices. This approach limited the understanding of internal class conflicts within Soviet state capitalism and precluded policy solutions addressing these conflicts. Furthermore, Soviet social theory's focus on wage earning as a marker of being part of the exploited working class hindered the ability to conduct class analyses of Soviet households, partly because no wage payments occurred there. This neglect meant that the class structures of households, where Soviet citizens spent a significant part of their lives, remained unexamined in terms of their impact on participation in enterprises and overall societal structures. Theoretical discourses on economics between Soviet and U.S. economists, despite their mutual hostilities, remarkably agreed on differentiating socialism from capitalism based on property ownership and distribution methods. This consensus ignored the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor. Post-1975, as Soviet economists grappled with the perceived economic crisis, their conceptual frameworks influenced the class dimensions of the USSR. Sutella identified three groups: Slavophile, Radical Socialist, and Westernizing. Each had implications for the USSR's class structures, but lacked a nuanced understanding of surplus labor and its organization. Sutella's counter-offensive in his counter-offensive, Sutella focuses on the concept of radical socialist economics, centralizing on the idea of decentralized worker self-management, known as the Arenda movement. This approach proposes that the state retains ownership of production means, but leases them to worker collectives for self-management. This arrangement is seen as a way to boost productivity and mitigate alienation, which Sutella identifies as a key factor in Soviet economic decline. The Arenda movement aims to establish genuine democratic socialism by shifting management from a centralized elite to the workers themselves. However, a notable absence in this formulation is the reference to surplus labor, echoing the oversight seen in the 1917 revolution. Under this model, workers would manage state-owned factories and farms and democratically negotiate the exchange of inputs and outputs, potentially through market mechanisms. Yet, this approach does not differentiate management from class structures, particularly in terms of surplus labor organization. Consequently, it is likely that self-managing workers might replicate the patterns established post-1917, focusing on efficiency rather than addressing potential exploitative class structures within their operations. Implementing the Arenda policy could potentially strengthen capitalist class structures rather than communist ones. State capitalist enterprises could transform into more private capitalist entities, and collective farms might rapidly shift from communist to private capitalist structures. The implications for private ancient enterprises are mixed. They might either diminish if absorbed by private capitalist enterprises or increase if they present more favorable opportunities. As of the writing of these lines, Westernizers who advocate for privatization and marketization are dominant in the Putin regime, facing various challenges. State capitalist industrial enterprises and communist collective farms continue to exist, struggling to maintain their presence. Meanwhile, a robust nationalist and conservative movement is gaining significant support, and proponents of Arenda and similar reorganizations are leveraging the shortcomings of Westernization to promote their preferred alternatives. The persistent class blindness in Soviet culture and economic theories means that the fundamental class composition of Soviet society remains unseen and unchallenged in cultural forms. This parallels the class blindness observed in the United States. Soviet culture's inability to confront its class structures has led to a perpetuation of state capitalism in industry, and a shift towards state and private capitalism and ancient private structures in agriculture. Additionally, Soviet households maintain their feudal and ancient class structures, partly due to the inability of Soviet culture to integrate a household class critique into its narratives. Post-World War II Soviet culture, focusing inward on private concerns, contributed to the maintenance of the state capitalist status quo and simultaneously bolstered private capitalist, ancient and feudal class structures in smaller enterprises and households. The celebration of private life and a general conservative reluctance towards social transformation also had contradictory class effects. Moreover, the ideological climate, limited to state planning or private market solutions, sets the stage for a potential shift to private capitalism, akin to those seen in European social democracies and the United States, should Soviet state capitalism lose public confidence. Post-war politics. In examining the impacts on class structures, the post-war Soviet political landscape reveals many parallels with its cultural conditions, to which it was intimately linked. Political developments, on the whole, served to bolster state capitalism up to the 1970s, and subsequently to erode it in favor of private capitalism. Similarly, politics played a role, albeit with contradictory outcomes, in the growth of private ancient class structures and the preservation of the inherited feudal and ancient class structures within Soviet households. We first explore the external political factors affecting the USSR in the decade following 1945. The combination of Cold War isolation, nuclear brinkmanship, and the weakening or defeat of communist parties and movements in many Western nations fostered a new version of the siege mentality that had previously fueled Soviet economic growth. The social drive to recover from the war's ravages gained popular support when merged with the pursuit of superpower status for defense purposes. The necessity of a robust central state apparatus to manage these endeavors appeared self-evident. Wage increases could be postponed while boosting labor productivity. Many believed that the Third World would be the post-war arena for the expansion of socialism and communism, which in partnership with the USSR would eventually encircle and overpower the privately advanced capitalist world. Mao's revolution in China until 1960, at least from the Soviet perspective, seemed to validate this view. Events as varied as Western rearmament post-war and the Hungarian uprising in 1956 highlighted the need for the Soviet Union to refocus on industrial growth, particularly in military-related industries. This international political climate supported the impressive, though uneven, expansion of state capitalist industry in the USSR over the 3 decades following the war. The state prioritized industrial growth, with technical advancements in military production often aiding non-military industrial expansion. Cold War alliances sometimes provided crucial industrial resources on more favorable terms. Conversely, this climate also introduced significant challenges for Soviet state capitalism. The arms race with the United States compelled the Soviet state to allocate increasing portions of its revenue to the military and related industries. This reduced the funds available for non-military industrial expansion, agricultural development, and social infrastructure. While the Cold War environment may have spurred Soviet workers to higher productivity, leading to increased state surpluses from state capitalist industries, it also diverted these surpluses into costly and quickly outdated weapons systems. If future trends slowed the growth of these surpluses or state revenue from other sources, while political factors increased military spending, a crisis of insufficient state revenue could quickly arise, unless non-military expenditures were cut. However, reducing these expenditures threatened the survival of both the state capitalism's class structures and the external private communist, capitalist, ancient, and feudal class structures. See Appendix A of this chapter. The international political scene also positioned the USSR against a singular hegemonic superpower, the United States. U.S. foreign policies, domestic laws, political practices, and prevailing political theories became the benchmark against which the USSR measured and defined much of its own political identity. The United States' remarkable post-1945 economic prosperity, military expansion, dominance over its allies, and the relative ease with which it navigated political setbacks further solidified this dynamic. In the West, the success of the U.S. was often attributed to private property, market economies, and political freedoms such as voting, independent mass media, and civil liberties, all encapsulated in a morally tinged celebration of decentralized democracy versus totalitarianism. Due to global bipolarity, U.S. political conditions and interpretations of their effects held significant sway in the USSR as well. As noted in a recent study, This necessitates a re-evaluation of how socialist societies were influenced by the capitalist West during periods of apparent internal stability. For instance, when signs of economic decline emerged in the post-war Soviet Union, policy debates often revolved around the relative benefits of decentralized, sometimes labeled democratized, versus centralized control of industrial production sites. Khrushchev's reforms in the late 1950s, Lieberman's a few years later, and the technical proposals of figures like Kantorovich, Nemchinov, and Novozhilev all centered on the extent and nature of decentralization that would best support Soviet economic growth. Decentralization was a focal point in policy discussions, both before and after the USSR's collapse. The debate didn't focus on the class structures of Soviet production sites. Reformers and their opponents alike assumed that workers would produce surpluses, increasingly referred to as profits, which would be appropriated by a distinct group. The debate was solely on whether these appropriators would be more effectively localized or centralized, organized by industry or geography, state-appointed or elected in some other manner. On one side, conservatives defined the USSR in opposition to the United States, advocating for centralized appropriation of industrial and agricultural surpluses in state enterprises and centralized distribution of resources and products. They saw this as embodying the socialist identity and uniqueness of the USSR. Conversely, the reformers or radicals argued that only decentralization to regional or local industrial or enterprise levels of authority could drive economic growth, which they viewed as central to the socialist endeavor. Almost universally, both sides presumed that industries and an increasing portion of farms would continue as state capitalist enterprises. The debate essentially revolved around the organization of the appropriation of state capitalist surpluses, whether it should be managed by a council of ministers in Moscow, local officials at the enterprise level, or other intermediaries. Radicals, the most radical stance in these debates, advocated for extensive decentralization, often characterized, as mentioned earlier, in terms of worker self-management. This approach was equated with democratization, based on the argument that the only true form of socialism was a democratic socialism. Under this model, local enterprise managers would be state officials, but also directly accountable to, and preferably elected by, the enterprise workers. Such democratization or decentralization was believed to yield optimal results in terms of worker productivity, while acknowledging that this accountability might compel local managers to allocate some surpluses for enhancing their workers' wages. Radicals contended that this would still leave ample surpluses for the state to foster industrial growth and other priorities. The notion of economic reform in the USSR, as in other socialist countries, was predominantly framed and debated in political terms. The central question was who would exert effective control over the means of production, be it central state officials, local state officials, or possibly even non-state local figures, and similarly, who would govern the distribution of resources and products, property owners and markets, local officials, or state central planners. In his detailed analysis of the type of economic reform that emerged in the post-war USSR, Yanis Kornai, 1992, argues that such reforms represented political shifts, making Soviet-type economies more akin to Western, particularly U.S. private capitalism. Kornai posits that socialism's primary distinction from capitalism is the replacement of private ownership with public ownership. Therefore, reform, in his view, essentially constituted a movement towards private property and market exchange within an ideological framework that minimizes state interference in private property and markets. International politics positioned the United States as a significant reference point for Soviet perspectives on their own society. The U.S. economic model, which systematically credited its economic and military success to its political institutions, notably laws safeguarding private property and limiting state intervention, exerted a subtle influence on both proponents and critics of post-war Soviet society. Critics saw the issues in Soviet economic and social systems as stemming from the absence of certain aspects of U.S. society, while supporters viewed the United States as a formidable adversary, militarily, politically, and economically. They sought to learn from and ultimately surpass the United States technologically, outmaneuver it politically on a global scale, and achieve a military stalemate. The U.S. profoundly influenced the USSR politically on multiple levels. The perception of the United States as a society with a less centralized and intrusive state apparatus compared to the USSR resonated with those in the USSR who associated US successes and Soviet shortcomings with this disparity. Soviet citizens, harboring various grievances against their state, often looked to the United States as a model for potential political transformation within Soviet society. The global US-USSR confrontation reinforced anti-state sentiments and theories within the USSR, contradicting yet coexisting with the strengthened state seen as essential for defending against US imperialism. Consequently, those more influenced by anti-state sentiment than defense-oriented views might have favored private capitalist and ancient enterprises over state capitalist ones. This shift in attitude could have adversely affected labor intensity and productivity in state capitalist enterprises, thereby impacting their profitability and the surpluses available to Soviet state planners. Moreover, the US-USSR détente, initiated by Nixon and Brezhnev in the early 1970s, altered the balance between anti-state and defense-oriented attitudes, influencing the surplus available to the Soviet state. On one hand, détente, perceived as a triumph of Soviet military strength, legitimized the mobilizations and sacrifices it necessitated. On the other hand, détente itself counteracted further mobilizations and sacrifices, validated a cultural shift towards private concerns, and facilitated greater scrutiny and opposition to Soviet state power. The political process of détente, by bolstering anti-state tendencies already emerging within the USSR, further weakened the Soviet state's capacity to appropriate surplus within its state capitalist enterprises. Détente also hastened the post-Stalin easing of political barriers to tourism, professional exchanges, and media programs between the USSR and other countries, including the United States. The consequences extended beyond a deeper Soviet understanding and appreciation of the United States as a less statist society. As Soviet citizens became aware of the disparity between their individual consumption levels and those in wealthier Western countries, many began questioning the legitimacy of Soviet political institutions. This skepticism partly stemmed from previous Soviet leadership claims about the superiority of their institutions. When Soviet consumption standards appeared to be catching up with the West, Khrushchev had not only promised Soviet workers living standards surpassing those in the United States, but also used this promise as a benchmark for the Soviet system's comparative success against the West. When détente subsequently revealed the unfulfilled nature of Khrushchev's promise, it served to deepen political disillusionment among Soviet workers and further complicate their contributions to state capitalist surplus production. America's, it was not just a matter of comparing US and Soviet consumption in quantitative terms, but also in qualitative ones. Détente, in particular, highlighted the significantly higher levels of private or individual consumption among US workers, especially in areas like housing, clothing, automobiles, meat, and appliances. In response, supporters of the USSR emphasized the collective consumption provided by the state to Soviet workers, including subsidized medical care, education, transportation, childcare, etc. This sparked a debate over the relative merits of private, individual versus state, collective forms of consumption. However, such a debate worked against the USSR, especially since it coincided with a growing inward, private focus and anti-state sentiment within Soviet culture. At this time, private consumables appeared to be of paramount importance. Détente allowed the United States to present itself as the embodiment of a level of private consumption that Soviet citizens could only aspire to. Furthermore, in the USSR, private consumption seemed closely linked to private ancient class structures. The most desired goods for private consumption, those beyond basic necessities, often originated from these structures. In these private ancient class structures, the link between personal labor effort and rewards in the form of increased personal consumption was most direct. If work in state capitalist enterprises and private capitalist or communist collective farms failed to produce the anticipated levels of private individual consumption, then such labor was deemed unworthy. Workers might feel justified in either reducing their effort in those enterprises and farms or shifting their efforts to private ancient class structural production sites, or possibly both. In addition to the effects of international politics and interactions with the United States, internal political changes in the USSR also played a role in the overdetermination of its class structures. Most economic reforms post-Stalin were, in reality, political. They decentralized the power to make managerial decisions to lower levels of the state apparatus. As discussed earlier in this chapter, post-war Soviet thinking increasingly associated the decentralization of managerial power with enhanced economic growth and development. This shift culminated in the 1987 Law on State Enterprises, which mandated that managers and directors would be elected by workers' collectives, though they would not be workers themselves and would remain under state control. In the years leading up to this law, a climate favoring decentralization expanded informal, out-of-plan interactions, exchanges, and mutual support among local enterprise managers and directors. Consequently, the central plan became less significant compared to the ad hoc arrangements of local enterprise managers in shaping the Soviet economy and society at large. This step could potentially serve as an intermediate stage in transitioning from state to private capitalism. Some insiders at the upper echelons of the Soviet political apparatus perceived political decentralization in these terms: the increasing managerial powers of local state officials in charge of individual enterprises or groups of enterprises brought them closer to potentially functioning as appropriators and distributors of the surpluses generated in those enterprises. Indeed, Soviet industrial development evolved before 1990 from 1. Centralized state capitalist appropriation of surplus and centralized management to 2. Centralized state capitalist appropriation and decentralized management to 3. Decentralized state capitalist appropriation and decentralized management. In the dramatically altered political landscape after 1990, the next evolutionary step, achieved with relatively little social upheaval, involved decentralized private capitalist appropriation with decentralized management. In the specific post-war USSR context, the decentralization of managerial power did contribute to a class transition from state to private capitalism. The cultural and political changes discussed, associated with decentralization, de-Stalinization, and détente, were either cautiously accepted or actively pursued by successive post-war Soviet regimes. However, these changes also appeared dangerous and threatening to many. Critics frequently argued that these changes risked halting Soviet progress, weakening socialism, equated with the central state's guidance of social development, or even derailing the centralized march through socialism to communism initiated by the 1917 revolution. Thus, there was a contradiction between the need for these changes and the need to preserve the revolutionary heritage of Soviet society. This heritage was typically depicted as state ownership and control of the economy's commanding heights, the Communist Party's political monopoly, and state party hegemony over most other social institutions, such as schools, mass media, the arts, etc. The way Soviet leaderships managed this contradiction led to further changes in political conditions with significant class implications. To address this contradiction, successive regimes combined decentralization and centralization in a specific manner. On one hand, centralized state controls over culture, politics, and economics diminished. On the other, membership and centralized social controls exercised by the Communist Party expanded, especially within the workplace. Simply put, especially during and after the 1970s, the party's role became more closely linked to monitoring, supervising, and managing. This was an attempt to counterbalance the relaxation of centralized state controls over the economy, politics, and culture. The party aimed to preserve the integrity, growth, and basic directions of the USSR, as well as its own position, while accommodating social pressures for decentralization and revaluation of private life. As Brezhnev stated at the 17th Komsomol Congress in 1974, the primary focus of the party's economic policy was to enhance the effectiveness of the country's economy. Consequently, Soviet development partly depended on this reconfiguration of the relationship between party politics and society. Would the Soviet Union's contradictions be managed by coupling state decentralization with the Communist Party's enhanced size, power, and reach? Or would these contradictions instead deepen and transform the party, thereby undermining its ability to manage them? While official Soviet Marxism assumed that economics always determines politics, the Communist Party's goals and activities suggested the opposite. Janos Kornai has summarized the outcomes of the Soviet economy's decentralization reforms initiated after Stalin's death. He contends that these reforms disrupted the coherence of the classical system of socialist economy, exacerbating the irrationalities of the Soviet planning system. Ministries, regions, industries, and enterprises increasingly secured their own interests by bypassing central plans. Decentralized economic planning introduced more uncertainty into the supply of materials and financial inputs needed by enterprises to meet their planned targets. Additionally, decentralization enabled enterprises, either individually or in groups, to sidestep targets or achieve them through hoarding resources or engaging in separate, private exchange agreements outside the central plan. As the well-being of these enterprises became increasingly dependent on circumventing central plans, the effectiveness of these plans declined. For Kornai, the economic inefficiencies arising from decentralized state planning necessitated a further shift towards a predominantly free market coordinated economy. It is important to note that decentralization of management does not necessarily undermine state capitalist appropriation of surplus labor. In the 1930s, local managers implemented various schemes outside of central plans to acquire needed resources, including food for workers, often delayed or never delivered as promised. This unintended decentralization of management supported Stalinism's centralized surplus appropriation of labor. However, in the post-Stalin era, and unlike the social environment of the 1930s, the enterprising efforts of managers, whether unintended or intentional under the reforms, likely undermined first centralized and then decentralized state capitalist appropriation. The difference lay in the attitudes of managers who, along with many others in the USSR, increasingly viewed themselves as coping with economic disorganization stemming from reforms, striving to secure their positions, and less involved in broader social movements or campaigns. Officially, the party believed that its expanded social rule would counteract the economic problems associated with decentralization reforms. However, this did not materialize. Instead, party leaders and members increasingly became entangled in the routines of circumventing the economic plans. Enterprises determined to operate outside central plans needed either the party's approval or its indifference. The party failed to rise to this economic challenge. Local, regional, and industrial managers, often party members themselves, persuaded party officials to condone the necessity of their semi-legal and illegal maneuvers under the new, reformed economic conditions. Where this proved difficult, the substantial gains from bypassing economic plans enable financial incentives, bribes, to supervising party authorities. This management corruption in addressing the problems of reformed economic planning spread to the corruption of the party itself. The decentralizing economy transformed the party more than the party was able to control it. Political corruption of the party, in terms of a growing systemic neglect of its economic control duties, evolved into individual corruption that incited increasing public anger and ridicule. Economic bureaucrats and party officers formed interlocking directorates that often went beyond merely maneuvering around central economic plans to securing privileges that elevated their individual living standards and power above those of average Soviet workers. Their alienation from the general populace deepened, as did public resentment towards a privileged Communist Party claiming to represent Soviet society. For most Soviet citizens, the system provided certain benefits, despite becoming increasingly distasteful, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. War seemed less of a threat to Soviet society, a victory attributed in part to state diplomacy. Levels of mass consumption, both collective and private, grew, albeit at slower rates. Cultural freedoms and space for private life expanded. Most importantly, a kind of entitlement to job security emerged as an almost absolute political commitment of the state and the Communist Party to Soviet workers. This led to the famous workers' joke from the post-1975 era: "They pretend to pay us properly, and we pretend to work properly." This joke succinctly encapsulated the economic, cultural, and political dilemmas the post-war USSR faced. The growth and corruption of the party had contradictory class consequences. On one hand, its presence and control functions within nearly all enterprises and labor unions likely increased labor intensity and productivity, thereby expanding the surplus and the state's revenue. However, as mentioned earlier, its activities probably also undermined labor productivity and surplus production in individual enterprises, redirecting appropriated surpluses to non-planned distributions or personal use. Another contradictory effect was the party's own operational costs, covered by state expenditures. A rapidly expanding Communist Party consumed more of the state's revenues, leaving less for other priority objectives like industrial growth, military preparedness, and public services for mass consumption. To maintain or increase the surpluses the state could appropriate from its capitalist enterprises, party policy often aimed to justify restraints on productive workers' wages. Similarly, party pressure sought to limit the portions of state capitalist surpluses spent on unproductive laborers, such as clerks, managers, etc., within these enterprises. At the same time, the unofficial activities of the party enriched its leaders and activists, further alienating them from public opinion. Resisting or avoiding hard work became a form of protest against the party's policies and pressures. This situation also led workers to shift their productive efforts from state enterprises to private ancient class structures, where the party intruded less. Productive laborers in state capitalist enterprises worked less intensely, damaged more tools, and produced lower quality outputs and or fewer outputs per hour, partly to express dissatisfaction with party policies or personnel, and partly because they were exhausted, having spent increasing time and energy on private plots and second economy ventures. Widespread distaste for the party, combined with envy of its privileges, especially after détente exposed Western standards of individual consumption, appeared to foster a significant rise in pilfering, particularly in the 1980s. In class terms, if outputs were pilfered, they represented a portion of the surplus produced by productive workers, but diverted from surplus appropriators. If means of production were pilfered, this corresponded to declines in labor productivity. Pilfering supplemented the perpetrators' incomes, possibly easing tensions in the ancient and feudal class structures of Soviet households. However, it directly and indirectly reduced the quantities of surplus appropriated in the USSR's state capitalist, private capitalist, and private communist enterprises. It is impossible to quantify the enlarged Communist Party's net effects on surplus production and appropriation in the USSR during the 1970s and 1980s. However, the broad literature suggests that the unintended negative results likely outweighed the intended positive goals. To the extent that Soviet leaders had hoped to manage the post-war reform movement by enlarging the centralized Communist Party's social rule, that plan failed. The party's evolution proved wholly inadequate to the task. The vast inward turn towards private and individual interests, away from state and social concerns, came to include resentment and anger towards both the party and the state. Central to this development was a growing gap between the surpluses produced and available to the state and the state expenditures necessary to sustain the USSR's post-war global position. The political guarantee of nearly absolute job security helped this highly contradictory and potentially unstable social situation to survive for as long as it did. However, it also contributed to further class structural difficulties, transitions, and the eventual crisis at the end of the 1980s. Job security in state capitalist enterprises had two problematic effects. First, automation was often blocked or slowed with labor-saving technologies added to existing ones rather than replacing them. The political untouchability of job security added significantly to these challenges. Thus, the surplus producing capacity of Soviet workers grew more slowly than the state's needs for surplus. Second, the number of unproductive workers, clerks, secretaries, managers, etc., grew, and they too enjoyed job security. In Marxian terms, the costs of their wages and their means of performing unproductive tasks represented a growing demand on the surplus produced by the productive workers. Inside state capitalist enterprises, job security for unproductive workers blocked or slowed their replacement by machines, such as office computerization. Had state capitalist enterprises been able to economize on the portion of their surpluses paid out for unproductive work, more surplus would have been available for the state to tap. In this way, the state was thwarted in seeking to enhance the revenues it needed to finance its expenditures. A historical irony emerges when comparing this Soviet dilemma with the different approach private capitalist enterprises in the West adopted at the same time. Intensified global competition among the three blocks of private capitalism. The United States, Western Europe, and Japan had introduced new demands on their surpluses, including rising sales costs, managerial expenses, and research and development outlays. Private capitalists had to either appropriate more surplus from their productive workers or reduce other surplus outlays to meet these new demands. The solution found in private capitalist economies was an attack on the state to reduce taxes and regulatory costs. Thatcher in the UK, Reagan and Bush in the US, and later more social democratic regimes elsewhere, commenced their politics of assault against the welfare state. By cutting state social and regulatory programs and state employment, taxes on private corporations' surpluses fell. At the same time, as state employment absorbed fewer unproductive workers, competition among them for remaining private sector jobs lowered private wages. As workers accepted lower wages, the value of their labor power fell. Since productive workers labored at least as long and productively as before, the surplus value appropriated by private capitalists rose steadily. The strategy of state reduction thus increased private capitalist surpluses while lowering the portion that had to be paid in taxes to the state. The privatization of formerly government-provided services also offered the private capitalist sector new commodities to be produced with cheaper workers, yielding increased surpluses on which fewer taxes had to be paid. Private capitalism solved its problems of financing new demands on its surpluses by appropriating more surplus from their workers and distributing less of it to the state. In direct contrast, the state capitalism of the USSR, also facing new demands on its surpluses, found no equally effective solution. In Soviet conditions, productive workers became less, not more, productive of surplus value. As U.S. private capitalists achieved markedly higher rates of exploitation, Soviet state capitalism's rate of exploitation fell further behind. As private capitalism in the U.S. economized on unproductive laborers, Soviet state capitalism moved in the opposite direction. These divergent patterns reflected typical, longer-run cycles affecting both state and private capitalisms. The cycles manifested unevenly in the 1980s and 1990s, a downturn in the USSR in the 1980s and in Japan after 1990, an upturn in the US in the 1990s, and mixed patterns in Western Europe. The 1990s displayed the consequences of the diverging conditions of U.S. private capitalism and Soviet state capitalism in the 1970s and 1980s. The U.S. experienced an unprecedented peacetime explosion of private corporate surplus appropriation, reflected in its stock market boom, which fueled a euphoric global celebration of neoliberalism. In contrast, the Soviet state could neither appropriate enough surplus in state capitalist enterprises, nor siphon enough surplus away from other class structures, nor find other revenues sufficient to secure its own survival even to the end of the 1980s. It was increasingly unable to simultaneously finance industrial expansion, military preparedness, global superpower status, and a rising standard of living for its masses. A population increasingly able and determined to compare the Soviet state's troubles with Western private capitalism's economic boom and political and cultural openness became ever more disaffected as citizens and unproductive as workers. The state and the party collapsed. In the post-World War era, the economic narrative of the Soviet Union presents a stark contrast to the trajectory of private capitalism, particularly in the United States. While Western private capitalist economies responded to new financial demands by reducing state social programs and regulatory frameworks, thereby lowering the tax burden on corporate surpluses, the Soviet state capitalism struggled to find a similarly effective approach. In the USSR, productivity and surplus value generation by workers declined, unlike in the US, where a marked increase in exploitation rates boosted surplus appropriation by private capitalists. This divergence reflects broader cyclical patterns observed in both state and private capitalism. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed the manifestation of these diverging paths. The United States experienced a significant rise in private corporate surplus, marked by a stock market boom and a global celebration of neoliberal ideals. In contrast, the Soviet Union struggled to generate sufficient surplus from state enterprises and other class structures. It faced increasing difficulties in funding industrial growth, military preparedness, and improving living standards, while maintaining its status as a global superpower. This economic stagnation, coupled with a population increasingly aware of and disillusioned by the discrepancies with the West's economic prosperity and openness, led to a growing disaffection among Soviet citizens and a decline in productivity. Ultimately, the state and the Communist Party collapsed. This period in Soviet history exemplifies a broader global pattern observed throughout the 20th century. The century's first half was marked by a shift from private to state capitalisms, a reaction to the challenges faced by private capitalist systems inherited from the 19th century. These challenges, culminating in various crises, were addressed through a range of solutions, from state-regulated, to state-managed and state-owned capitalisms. Notable examples included the authoritarian regimes of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, and on the left, the post-1917 USSR. However, the crises of the 1970s in state-regulated, managed, and owned capitalisms triggered a reversal, moving towards more privatized forms of capitalism. The transition of the post-Soviet states back to private capitalism stands as a prominent illustration of this shift, marking the complexities and dynamics of economic systems and ideologies throughout the 20th century. Post-war economy today, I want to delve into the complexities of the post-war economy, particularly focusing on the transformative years following 1945. In this era, we witnessed a seismic shift in the Soviet Union's economic landscape. This period was marked by a surge in trade relations with foreign nations, a critical pivot in the USSR's economic strategy. The import of machinery and foodstuffs soared, underscoring a heightened emphasis on industrial growth and the challenges of sustaining Soviet workers with domestic agricultural produce. A pivotal moment came with the emergence of fuels and energy as the Soviet Union's major export industry. From a modest 9.6% of Soviet exports in 1955, this sector skyrocketed to account for 52.1% by 1982. Concurrently, Soviet trade with capitalist countries gained momentum, eventually balancing out its trade with other socialist nations. However, this growth was not without its complications. The Soviet Union increasingly leaned on foreign debt to finance its trade, leading to a substantial rise in gross Soviet debt, from $12.5 billion in 1975 to a staggering $47.8 billion by 1989. While direct foreign investment within the USSR remained minimal, the nation did secure bank loans. This economic strategy served a dual purpose. On one hand, it bolstered Soviet state capitalism. Imported machinery catalyzed technical innovation in industry, thus enhancing the surplus value accruing to the state capitalists. Additionally, foreign bank borrowing supplemented their surpluses, which were then redistributed to secure further growth and stability. The importation of grain also played a crucial role, reducing the need for state investment in domestic agriculture and freeing up resources for other state endeavors. Yet, on the flip side, this strategy came with its own set of challenges. The need to repay debt and cover the interest costs of rising debt imposed new demands on surpluses. The Soviet state had to balance the benefits of borrowing against the costs, interest payments to foreign lenders, which detracted from capital accumulation, the arms race, the burgeoning party apparatus, and meeting domestic economic needs. As borrowing increased, primarily to cover interest costs, the USSR found itself in a perilous spiral, one familiar to many Third World debtors. This dependency on borrowing exposed the Soviet economy to the risk of loan cutoffs in case of interest payment delays or defaults. Furthermore, post-1975 productivity issues in Soviet state capitalist enterprises, the primary borrowers, indicated a shift in balance. The costs of borrowing began to outweigh the gains, leading to a net drain on Soviet surpluses and consequently impairing the state's ability to maintain its economic stability and growth. The net drain on the Soviet surplus, which was a defining characteristic of its foreign borrowing, was compounded by the costs associated with the state's reliance on state capitalist enterprises' oil exports. These exports, particularly oil, were the most rapidly rising and largest of all Soviet export commodities. When oil prices exceeded their values in terms of Soviet production conditions, the resulting difference was a windfall gain. In Marxist value terms, this represented an additional non-class revenue inflow for the state, which could be used for various expenditures. However, when world oil prices fell below their values, Soviet state capitalists producing oil could not realize a portion of the surplus values in that oil. This reduction in state capitalist surplus value had negative ramifications throughout the system, affecting state revenues and creating challenges in acquiring sufficient foreign currencies for imports and servicing foreign debt. From the earliest days of the USSR, debates around foreign trade oscillated between its proponents and detractors. The core issue was whether the gains from trade outweighed the risks and uncertainties of dependence on it. In Marxist theoretical terms, this debate centered on the value-enhancing versus value-depleting effects of trade. Factors influencing this balance included political actions of foreign states, market strategies of private foreign merchants and industrial enterprises, and the Soviet state's utilization of trade benefits. The deteriorating health and productivity of the Soviet economy in the 1970s and beyond negatively impacted the ability to benefit from trade, raising concerns about debilitating trade dependence. The post-war opening to trade also influenced Soviet class structures in other ways. It introduced scarce foreign consumer goods, sometimes illicitly, into the USSR. The transportation, replication, and trading of these goods bolstered the second economy, enabling more individuals to earn income through participation in it. Given that the second economy likely exhibited an ancient class structure, trade stimulus contributed to the expansion of this structure. Additionally, the levels of real wages and other forms of family income were significant factors shaping Soviet class structures. Estimates in the mid-1970s suggested that the average monthly income per family was around 342 rubles, with a Soviet family of 4 needing approximately 300 to 400 rubles per month for sustenance. Many families supplemented their resources through produce from their family plot or a second job, often in the second economy, potentially involving participation in ancient class processes. The gender wage gap, with women earning significantly less than men, also influenced participation in ancient class structures such as private plot farming or the second economy. The distribution of wages among Soviet citizens after the war also played a role in class change. Studies indicated a trend towards wage equalization among Soviet workers from the 1950s through the early 1970s. However, this trend shifted to stable and then growing inequality in the 1980s. The rise of the second economy before 1975, and its even greater significance after, suggested an increase in income inequality. This worsening wage inequality within state capitalist enterprises in the 1980s likely drove more workers to seek second jobs in the second economy or even full-time immersion in it, reinforcing their withdrawal from their primary occupations in the first economy. In summary, the economic conditions of the post-war Soviet Union, including its foreign trade and borrowing, the distribution of wages, and the growth of the second economy, all played pivotal roles in shaping its class structures and the overall health of its economy. State, enterprise, and household transitions from 1945 to the mid-1970s, non-class changes impacted, but did not fundamentally alter the USSR's class structures. However, the 1970s and 1980s witnessed a different dynamic, where the interplay of class and non-class elements of Soviet life evolved. Cultural, political, and economic shifts made it increasingly challenging after the mid-1970s for state capitalist industries and farms to generate sufficient surpluses. These surpluses were necessary for securing the absolute social priority of rapid industrial capital accumulation, enabling the state to maintain Soviet superpower status and provide growing levels of collective consumption, and funding the considerably enlarged party apparatus and state capitalist bureaucracy. The state struggled to acquire adequate revenues from other sources to bridge this gap, including insufficient additional value flows from private class structures or income from direct levies on individuals. This growing disparity between class and non-class revenues and the necessary expenditures to sustain them signaled an impending crisis for the USSR. The formula SVC plus SSCP-C plus A plus F plus COM plus NCR less than SSCP-C plus XC plus A plus F plus COM plus Y exemplifies this inequality and looming crisis. Private capitalist and communist collective farms face similar, though less severe, challenges in generating adequate surpluses for their existence. In contrast, private farm plots and the second economy, mostly ancient class structures, were successful in generating and distributing surpluses for their health and growth. Neither Brezhnev nor his successors managed to reverse this emerging pattern of change resulting from the post-1970 dynamic between the USSR's class and non-class processes. During the 1980s, these class problems and changes influenced the cultural, political, and economic processes of Soviet society, leading to a social crisis. State capitalist enterprises' efforts to extract more surplus from workers heightened worker disaffection, leading to various forms of resistance, including job actions and strikes. Political disaffection grew as leadership seemed powerless to reverse economic declines, sparking demands for civil liberties, resentment of the party, and calls to end its political monopoly. Rising expectations and demands for higher consumption levels further aggravated popular discontent. Private class structures became increasingly attractive for income and work experiences compared to state capitalist enterprises, eroding the viability of these enterprises and their legitimacy. By the 1980s, it was evident to some Soviet leaders that the crisis required drastic changes, unprecedented in Soviet history. Gorbachev, followed by Yeltsin and Putin, embarked on paths of significant reform. The USSR eventually dissolved as a political entity, reduced its military aspirations and apparatus, stripped the party of its political monopoly, and transition towards Western-style parliamentarism. Property and means of production began to be privatized, and private markets, a banking system, and a stock market started replacing state planning. The crisis prompted a radical downsizing of the state in Soviet society and a shift in its social rules, with private citizens and groups increasingly taking over surplus appropriation functions. This transformation did not change the capitalist class structure of most industrial and agricultural production. Instead, private capitalists replaced state officials within the same class structure. Throughout the 1980s and beyond, both supporters and critics of the USSR continued to theorize its uniqueness in terms of its socialist class structure, focusing on the social distribution of power over property, markets, and resources. The crisis and subsequent reforms underscored the need for more fundamental policy changes beyond the marginal adjustments attempted in the post-war period. By fundamental, the Gorbachev-Yeltsin-Putin administrations meant a concept deeply rooted in the 70-year history of theorizing the USSR's socialism. Administrators, like most Soviet citizens, shaped their thoughts and actions based on these established theories. Consequently, the necessary fundamental changes appeared evident: a shift in the social distribution of power, and a radical alteration in ownership, management, and operation of production means and markets. If the state was to relinquish ownership, enterprise management, operation, and planning powers, the consensus was that the only viable alternative was private ownership, management, and operation, supplemented by market exchanges among these new private owners. However, debates arose over subsidiary aspects: the nature of private ownership, individuals, groups, or both, the extent of remaining state ownership and planning in a privatized market economy, the role of foreign capitalists in privatization, and the degree of political and cultural adjustments, including state control reduction and party monopolies. Different visions emerged regarding the transition's goal. Some aimed for a democratic, social democratic, or democratic socialist society, emphasizing cooperatives, worker-leased factories, and worker-owned enterprises, advocating for a robust interventionist state. Others sought a minimalist state approach and a capitalist corporate structure akin to those in Britain and the US. Across all viewpoints, the common interpretation of fundamental change was the transformation of the social distribution of power. This was succinctly articulated by Kamensky, 1991-211, emphasizing the emergence of an autonomous, competitive economic system as a critical indicator of a successful transition. The late 1980s and onwards signified a power shift from the central state apparatus and the Communist Party to a private economy and parliamentary polity. However, class structures in terms of surplus production, appropriation, and distribution garnered less attention than after 1917, when private capitalism ceded to state capitalism. This reversal marked the post-1989 period. In this context, our Marxian analysis focuses more on class structures than power shifts. By 1994, private capitalist enterprises significantly replaced state capitalist enterprises, shifting surplus appropriation from the state to private individuals. Collective farms, regardless of their class structures, faced challenges, with some dissolving into private enterprises. The ancient class structures of private plots and the second economy also evolved, sometimes surviving, sometimes merging into new private capitalist enterprises. Household class structures, predominantly feudal and ancient, remained unchanged and unchallenged during this crisis. Despite societal pressures, no explicit discussion or actions aimed to alter these structures. The post-war Soviet household faced intense strains, with women shouldering a double shift of work both outside and inside the home, exacerbating household tensions. The class changes of the late 1980s primarily involved a shift from state capitalist to private capitalist enterprises in industry and agriculture, without a fundamental transformation from a communist to a capitalist, class-structured economy. The Soviet Union's diverse mix of class structures remained, with only minor adjustments in their relative proportions and significant changes in the balance of state and private capitalisms. The Communist Party's social position as the vanguard and manager of the USSR's direction could not endure the crisis of the 1980s. Its association with control, retrenchment, and decline, along with the perception of it as an elite responsible for societal decline, led to its eventual downfall. Households, too, saw no significant challenges to their class structures. Despite the double shift faced by women and increasing familial tensions, these structures persisted unchanged. Conflicts within households, in turn, impacted societal productivity, attitudes towards the state and the party, and revived old patterns of national or ethnic scapegoating. This interplay between household and societal crises further exacerbated the Soviet Union's decline. The collapse. The late 1970s and 1980s witnessed rapid and profound economic, political, and cultural changes, which struck Soviet society and external observers as mysterious and overwhelming. Many dismissed these changes, believing them to be minor or temporary. Others revisited or modified past reforms and campaigns, assuming these measures could reverse the tide of events. Conflicts intensified rapidly across Soviet society, with debates centering on two perceived alternatives. Initially, discussions revolved around variations of centralized versus decentralized socialism. Soon, however, the discourse expanded to include different models of socialism, encompassing degrees of private property, market freedom, political pluralism, and more. Surprisingly quickly, a new openness to discussing these options as either socialism or capitalism emerged, replacing the previous narrower focus on types of socialism. The fundamental dichotomy in these debates, common to all descriptions of the alternatives, was not new. It had long been a central theme in Soviet society, outlining two paths, one favoring private property, multi-party parliamentarism, cultural freedom, and market economies, and the other advocating for state or collective property, state-controlled markets, and Communist Party dominance in politics and culture. This classic dichotomy resurfaced repeatedly as reformers or liberals clashed with bureaucrats or conservatives. The situation became critical as economic growth slowed. The Afghanistan debacle signaled a decline in Soviet superpower status, and the détente highlighted disparities between Soviet and U.S. living standards. These factors contributed to a cumulative and irreversible descent into crisis from the early 1970s peak of the USSR. Soviet leaders, recognizing their system's exhaustion, transitioned from state control towards privatization, market economies, multi-party politics, and private cultural life. This marked the collapse of the Soviet system. However, Soviet leaders failed to comprehend the class dynamics underlying their impasse and the transformations they were undergoing. They didn't fully grasp that they were preserving the capitalist class structure and industry, merely shifting from state to private forms of exploitation. They also unwittingly undermined rural communism in collective farms, inadvertently promoting more traditional and capitalist class structures. This lack of understanding of the class crises in both industrial and agricultural sectors, as well as the collective farms' communist and capitalist structures, led to their downfall. Thus, while our analysis diverges in its theoretical approach, it aligns with other commentators in rejecting the notion that the Soviet system collapsed solely because party and state officials sought to convert their power into private wealth. While such motives might have influenced some, our analysis emphasizes how the class contradictions in Soviet development shaped these motives, expanded their influence, and facilitated their dominance. The Soviet people and leadership, in dismantling state capitalism and the Communist Party's political hegemony, inadvertently preserved and even strengthened capitalism as the dominant mode of surplus labor organization in both industry and agriculture. Gorbachev and Yeltsin, in their efforts to save the system, removed the state and the party from their central rules, transitioning from a discredited state capitalism to its private counterpart. This shift parallels Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to save capitalism in the United States through state intervention to address the failures of private capitalism. While numerous non-class aspects of life collapsed along with the USSR, its capitalist class structures not only survived but flourished in their new private forms. The death of the Soviet experiment, the end of the Soviet experiment, shares similarities with its inception. At both junctures, a lack of class awareness in the theories guiding the agents of change, coupled with the social constraints they faced, impeded any fundamental class transformation beyond capitalism. In 1917 and beyond, these agents did not transition society-wide from capitalism to communism. Similarly, in 1989 and beyond, there was no comprehensive shift from communism to capitalism. The Soviet Revolution indeed precipitated significant changes in economics, politics, and culture. However, except for a brief period in agriculture, it did not transform the social organization of surplus labor from capitalist to communist modes. The Bolsheviks nationalized productive property, implemented central planning, and stripped various groups, including private capitalists, feudal landlords, orthodox clergy, czarist officials, merchants, bankers, and others, of their traditional and subordinate class positions. These groups lost their pre-1917 political, economic, and cultural dominance. In this process, the Bolsheviks reinforced ancient class structures in agriculture and created a vast new state capitalist class structure in industry, later extending it to state farms. By the end of the 1920s and throughout the 1930s, they also established private communist class structures in collective farms, allowed some collective farms to transition to private capitalist structures, and post-war actively promoted the expansion of state capitalist farms alongside collective ones. Thus, Soviet leaderships transferred hegemony from the old classes to a new group comprising government ministers, Communist Party leaders, top managers of state enterprises, high-ranking state officials, intellectuals, and journalists. Remarkably, many of these individuals originated from families in the lowest class echelons before 1917, marking a significant societal transformation for millions. However, the Bolsheviks were unable to move beyond the shift from private to state capitalism. Despite significant economic growth, increased global political power, and improved living standards, achieved amidst the adversities of wars, foreign invasions, civil strife, and continuous external hostility, their class-agnostic theories led them to misconstrue these accomplishments as indicators of having transcended capitalism and progressed towards socialism and communism. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, inheriting and perpetuating the class-agnostic theories of their Bolshevik predecessors, have also enacted major changes, often in direct opposition to Bolshevik policies. Over the past 2 decades, they have been dismantling state capitalist enterprises and much of the state bureaucracy, replacing them with private capitalist enterprises and markets. Their policies of privatization have gradually replaced the few remaining communist class structures in agriculture with more traditional and capitalist structures. By dissolving the Communist Party's political and cultural monopoly, they have overseen the rapid development of a multi-party parliamentary system, private media, and universities reliant on business, mirroring the typical civil society structure in Western nations. Bound by their class-agnostic views, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin's followers perceive and laud these changes as evidence that the former USSR nations have fundamentally severed ties with and surpassed the old Soviet economic and social systems. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, inheriting the class-blind theory from the Bolsheviks, have also enacted significant changes, often directly opposing the Bolsheviks' methods. Over the past 20 years, they have dismantled state capitalist enterprises and much of the state bureaucracy, replacing them with private capitalist enterprises and markets. Privatization and similar policies are replacing the few remaining communist class structures in agriculture with more traditional and capitalist ones. Having eliminated the Communist Party's political monopoly and cultural control, they are overseeing the rapid development of a multi-party parliamentary system, private media enterprises, and universities dependent on business enterprises, reflecting the civil society model typical in Western societies. Adhering to their class-blind social theories, the followers of Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin interpret and celebrate these changes as signs that the nations of the former USSR have fundamentally broken with and surpassed the Soviet economic and social system. Like their Bolshevik predecessors, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin fail to recognize their rules as mere agents in the oscillation between state and private capitalism. They perceive themselves as catalysts of more substantial changes. Lenin at least briefly considered the potential for communist class structures distinct from capitalist ones. He aspired to be more than just an agent of a shift from one form of capitalism to another, even while acknowledging his limitations in achieving this. With Stalin's rise to power, what Lenin had envisioned as a future possibility was instead proclaimed as already accomplished. Official Marxian theory equated the establishment of Soviet power with the abolition of classes. The sacrifices of militants who had driven the revolution, won the Civil War, built a state-dominated industry and marketing system, and secured the Communist Party's power, were deemed to have eradicated classes and established socialism in the USSR. Neither Stalin nor the dominant groups within Soviet society could concede that their immense struggles and sacrifices from 1917 to 1989 amounted to nothing more than a shift from private to state capitalism in class terms. Similarly, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, along with their global supporters, are unable to acknowledge or even envisage that their social rule has been limited to facilitating another shift of capitalism, this time from a state to a private form. They and their advocates need to conceptualize their actions as the defeat of communism and a victory for capitalism, democracy, civil liberties, freedom, and prosperity. They are driven to believe that their version of capitalism will resemble the systems in Sweden, Germany, or France, rather than those in Turkey, Mexico, or India. They hope that mass corruption is just a transitional phase limited to a gang or mafia, and not a new norm in social life. Essentially, they endeavor to shape the public perception of the post-Soviet transition, emphasizing the temporary nature of problems, blaming the former USSR, the ongoing progress, a bright future, and the impossibility of reverting to the past, while discrediting critics as proponents of such a return. Currently, conceptualizations of classes in the surplus labor sense are absent. Without these, it is not difficult to predict how post-Soviet society will react to the first major crisis in its private capitalist economy. Some may call for a fundamental change, potentially leading to a Russian version of FDR, who could swing the pendulum back to a liberal or leftist state-managed private capitalism, or even further, to a state capitalism. Conversely, others might demand a shift towards a more rightist, state-managed, or even fascist state capitalism. In either scenario, a transition from private back to state capitalism will be misconstrued as a fundamental change from one social system to another. The USSR's historical trajectory was neither an isolated event nor an anomaly in the broader context of social and political movements. Throughout history, communities facing social crises have often sought to challenge and reform the prevailing class structures, particularly those related to capitalism. This phenomenon has occurred and will likely continue, irrespective of whether class structures are explicitly analyzed in terms of surplus labor. Hence, pertinent questions arise. What will be the nature of future uprisings against societies dominated by capitalist class structures, whether state-driven or privately controlled? What lessons will people draw from the USSR's experiences? In regions where revolts arise against state capitalisms, will the thought processes and strategies of the people be confined to merely reverting to private capitalism? Conversely, in situations where uprisings are against private capitalisms, will the aim be restricted to transitioning to state capitalism? The type of class analysis applied to the USSR in this discussion might contribute to a broader understanding, suggesting that communist class structures could be explored and implemented on a larger scale as a viable alternative to all forms of capitalism. For us, this insight forms the crux of the response to the critical question, what is to be done? This perspective encourages a deeper examination of not just the economic and political structures, but also the underlying class dynamics that shape societies. It proposes that learning from the USSR's history involves not merely observing the outcomes, but understanding the complex interplay of class forces, political decisions, and social movements. It underscores the necessity of a nuanced approach to societal change, one that transcends traditional dichotomies of state and private capitalism and seeks innovative solutions that are equitable and sustainable. In future upheavals against prevailing capitalist structures, the challenge will be to avoid repeating historical patterns of simply oscillating between state and private forms of capitalism. Instead, there's an opportunity to conceive and implement novel structures that truly address the root causes of societal discontent. These alternatives could embody principles of fairness, communal benefit, and sustainable development, moving beyond the constraints of traditional capitalist frameworks. The lessons from the USSR, therefore, extend beyond its specific historical context, offering universal insights into the potential for transformative social change. This realization paves the way for a more profound reimagining of societal structures, one that genuinely aligns with the aspirations and needs of the people. The value equation for international terms of trade: consider the scenario of a state capitalist industry that imports machinery while exporting processed oil. For simplicity, will set aside foreign exchange considerations. When this industry trades oil to merchants at world prices exceeding its domestic values, it generates a non-class revenue flow. This revenue represents the USSR's value gain from participating in international trade at favorable world export prices. Conversely, the value loss incurred from importing machinery at world prices higher than domestic values per unit can be quantified as the state capitalist industry distributing an additional portion of domestic surplus value to foreign merchants in the form of a new subsumed class payment. Therefore, when considering the exports of oil and imports of machinery together, the impact of the international terms of trade, the ratio of export to import prices on the USSR state capitalist industry can be expressed as SVC plus NCRC oil equals SSCPC plus SSCPC, Mach here. NCR oil equals PEV oil x UV oil. SSCPC Mach equals PEV Mach x UV Mach, with the equality sign indicating an assumed balance of respective gains and losses from the USSR's trading at these international world prices. An inequality in the equation would signify either trading gains or losses, depending on whether the foreign terms of trade were favorable or unfavorable to the USSR. Improved price terms would result in NCR oil being greater than SSCPC Mach, while worsened terms would yield the opposite effect. The impact of such international shifts in the terms of trade on state capitalist development parallels the internal movements, the ratio of agricultural to industrial prices observed during both the NEP and collectivization periods. For example, if the international terms of trade turned in favor of the USSR, it would enable the state to enhance SSCPC, thereby fostering its state capitalist development. This development, however, does not occur in isolation. It is influenced by a variety of factors, such as consumption rates, the political atmosphere, and shifts in agricultural and industrial structures within the Soviet economy. The fluctuating importance of state capitalist farms, the variable class structures of collective farms, and the evolving role of private plots in agriculture are all crucial elements in this complex equation. These dynamics not only shaped the Soviet economy, but also reflected broader societal changes, including shifts in labor force participation, household class structures, and the overall direction of economic policy. Understanding these intricate relationships is vital for comprehending the Soviet economy's evolution and its responses to both internal and external pressures. The state's focus on heavy industrial growth, influenced by historical circumstances such as post-war reconstruction and the Cold War, and its impact on different sectors and class structures, is a critical aspect of this analysis. Moreover, the Soviet state's interactions with international markets and the resulting shifts in terms of trade played a significant role in shaping its economic trajectory and class dynamics. The complexity of these interactions highlights the multifaceted nature of the Soviet economy and the importance of considering a broad range of factors in any analysis of its performance and policies. The collapse and subsequent transformation of the USSR represent a watershed moment in modern history, involving a multifaceted interplay of ideologies, political strategies, and historical contexts. This monologue aims to explore these complexities, focusing on the roles of pivotal figures like Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, and Anatoly Alexandrovich Sobchak, and delving into the ideologies and political dynamics that shaped this era. Liberal or neoliberal ideologies and the Small Russia project, the USSR's dissolution, seen through the lens of liberal or neoliberal ideologies, reveals an intricate strategy aimed at creating a small Russia. This strategy involved relinquishing control over satellite states in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, aiming for reconciliation with Western Europe and integration into the Western market. However, it still sought to retain significant territories in Central Asia and the Russian Far East, including regions like Mongolia and parts of Manchuria. The objective was to maintain a substantial empire while economically opening up to the West. Failure of liberal, neoliberal politicians. The perceived failure of politicians like Putin and his mentor Sobchak is evident in their inability to maintain the cohesion of this smaller, yet considerable empire. This is particularly noticeable in Ukraine, where efforts to maintain influence resulted in heightened tensions and eventual loss of control, exacerbating the fragmentation of former Soviet territories post-2000. The end of communism and the proletarian revolution in the USSR. The The demise of communism in the Soviet Union was influenced by economic challenges, political reforms, and external pressures. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost initiated reforms that inadvertently accelerated the Soviet system's unraveling. Boris Yeltsin's leadership marked a departure from communist ideologies, moving towards market-oriented reforms and political restructuring. Comparison with Bolshevik and globalist tendencies. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin contrast with Bolshevik revolutionaries in their ideologies and global strategies. While the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Stalin focused on global revolution and the spread of communism, the post-Soviet leaders, particularly Yeltsin and Putin, adopted a more pragmatic approach, blending nationalism with selective global integration. Putin's strategy signifies a departure from both Bolshevik internationalism and pure globalism, focusing on reasserting Russia's power and influence, primarily through geopolitical means. Anatoly Alexandrovich Sobchak's influence, Sobchak, as Putin's political godfather, played a significant role in transitioning from communism to a more liberal political order in Russia. His background, linked to regions with historical ties to the Qing Chinese royal family, as a fascinating dimension to his impact on shaping post-Soviet Russia. Economic unsustainability of the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Union faced substantial economic issues, including worker productivity problems and inadequate reinvestment in key economic sectors. The Soviet model, initially driving rapid industrialization and technological advances, struggled to keep pace with the global economy due to a rigid bureaucratic system and a lack of innovation incentives. Over-reliance on Western technology and markets. The Soviet Union's increasing reliance on Western technology and markets, despite the ideological and geopolitical rift, highlighted its incapacity to sustain its superpower status independently. This over-reliance underscored the Soviet Union's diminishing capacity to sustain its superpower status independently. Shift to Small Russia strategy. The Small Russia strategy was a pragmatic response to these challenges, aiming for a more sustainable model that could integrate more effectively with the global economy, especially the Western markets. This strategy involved scaling back Soviet Empire ambitions, focusing on maintaining economically and politically manageable core territories. Post-Soviet transition and challenges. The transition to a smaller Russian state was marked by economic difficulties and political turmoil. Leaders like Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin had to balance economic reform and modernization with retaining Russia's global stature. Post-Soviet power struggles. The post-Soviet era was characterized by regional power groups vying for control in newly independent states like Russia and Ukraine. The St. Petersburg Group, linked with Putin, contrasted with Ukrainian groups like those in the Dnieper region, reflecting the complexities of post-Soviet geopolitics. Long-term consequences. The ongoing tensions and conflicts in the region trace back to these initial post-Soviet power struggles, influencing Russia and Ukraine's relationship and their internal political developments. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin's legacy. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin dismantled state capitalist enterprises and bureaucracy, replacing them with private capitalist enterprises and markets. They eliminated the Communist Party's political monopoly, overseeing the development of a multi-party parliamentary system, private media enterprises, and universities dependent on business enterprises. However, they, like their Bolshevik predecessors, failed to recognize their roles as agents in the oscillation between state and private capitalism. In conclusion, the transition from the USSR to a smaller, economically viable Russian state reflects a strategic adaptation to global changes. This adaptation was not merely a reduction in size or influence, but a strategic reorientation towards a more viable economic and political model, one that came with its own challenges and contradictions. The post-Soviet era's complexities, marked by power struggles and shifting ideologies, continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of the region and beyond. The Soviet ruling class did not believe in Marxism and communism. Second or third generation Soviet citizen bureaucrats openly taunted that Marxism is childish, a fantasy only believable in a fantasy land. As the ruling class inbred, they demanded more stability, moving one step further away from communism. On the other side of the power structure, Valery Mikhailovich Sablin and his radical comrades aspired to initiate a second workers' revolution, aimed at reinstating either Stalinism or syndicalism. The latter approach would later become the main focus in the Americas, exemplified by the co-op economy and Jeremy Corbyn's workers' takeover of the stock market, thereby seizing control of the means of production. The battle between the Politburo poster boys and the proletarian vanguards would never end the empire, if not another overlooked aspect of Soviet social structure. A political plot similar to the Wall Street Putsch had been brewing for decades. Like all revolutions, which are often the result of widespread indiscriminate discrimination, this situation saw the emergence of radical elements of the populace, ready to make a point at any cost, even in the Soviet environment, where belief in the afterlife was non-existent. These radical revolutionaries, or what we might call ordinary people, were willing to ignore their long-term survival and personal interests to challenge power, with others soon following. The colored revolution strategy centered on creating martyrs, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice at the right moment. The Soviet Union had for too long oppressed the needs and wants of the Supermans, or Übermensch ruling elites. Radical individuals were prepared to make sacrifices, even at the cost of their political careers. Thus, we had the drunkard who, at the crucial moment, chose not to take the throne of Secretary of the Supreme Soviet, but rather the lower position of the President of Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. What can I say and what do you expect? When the Soviet Union harshly punished Maoists and Stalinists since the 1960s, imprisoning vanguardists and the most radical communist pioneers, one might wonder who would die for the homeland of the proletarian revolution. They killed Sablin, so don't expect him to come back to life and defend the Union. The Workers' Union in the USSR increasingly became yellow unions, preserving the state apparatus, as the relationship between workers and their employers reverted to the old Russian Empire way. Feudalism was the word. Small kingdoms within the Soviet Union emerged as factory bureaucrats became feudal lords, their service being to run their fiefdoms and provide taxes to the Supreme Soviet. Workers feared these bureaucrats more than employees in Western democracies feared their employers, as all salary, food, and housing were provided to the worker through the factory leaders. If the worker did not bribe their plantation leader, they would not receive the many benefits the state planned for their family. When Brezhnev planned new workers' communities, guess who had the keys to the new city? It was the feudal lords of the Soviet Union, low-ranking bureaucrats who were also running productions. When the right time came, those factory lords would most definitely defend the feudalism state of Russia and fight syndicalism to death. Neoliberalism is the ideology rewarding monopolistic capitalists, aka oligarchs. You cannot be stupid to be factory heads. You need a prestigious degree from Petrograd doctorates.
Boom! Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim. Wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Treaslav Peace and the Reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.